on the problem of climate change. If you know many more, even a few that I may not know of, I would love to hear of them. Because aside from being involved in this panel, we'll be giving my first class on climate change at NYU sometime in the fall, and I love to hear the papers and questions and problems. I'm really overwhelmed by it all, but I'd love to hear more of anyone here. Those of some where there's been a bunch of Marxists who got together to actually talk on climate change and its related problems, but the centerpiece will be on climate change. So welcome. I hope you get something out of this, which you can also with students and others that might be or should be used. Our speakers today are Michael Hudson, who is probably the outstanding Marxist writer on anything and everything to do with debt, and is just published, I think it's already out, the book on the history of that called The Future, Forgive Them of Their Debts, which goes pretty far back to how far, Michael, where does it begin?
2500 BC, but actually in the late Neolithic.
Okay, well, and aside from that, there's a number of other works, and we just that another work which has been recently gotten a lot of very welcome and well-deserved applause from the people interested in the area, and that is called J is for Junk Economics. So it's a serious criticism of bourgeois economics, but also a good deal of humor. He will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Harvey, who is probably the Marxist who's the most serious, and I will go so far as to say not just good, but excellent works on a whole number of problems which anyone interested in Marxism needs to know more about. And it's probably because of that our best known scholar, our people on the Marxist side of the struggle. David is probably best known of many of us writing those kinds of works. And I have Bertell Ollman. I have written a number of works, 3 of them which deal more or less with dialectics, which is going to come into my presentation in an important way, but also has produced a number of other books related to the Marxist theory on alienation, and some of you may have seen or even played another piece I did, which I take very seriously, a board game called Gaston.
Can you get closer to the microphone?
Yes, there. People in the back haven't heard what I said. Okay, good. So let's begin then with our first speaker, Michael Hudson. Michael?
There was some discussion about how we should entitle the talk that will be given. And the big question we have to the organizers is, what is Marxist about our analysis for climate change? Well, as you know, there are 2 people from the group that is promoting climate change and global warming, the Green Party. In the little rooms in the next building, Margaret Flowers and Jill Stein. As you know, the Green Party's role is to support Wall Street and to support the oil industry and to distract most opposition to global warming, so that American foreign policy, can you close the door when you come in? As you know, the Green Party in almost every country is the right-wing party, supporting the banks, supporting the large industries. So what makes our analysis Marxist is, first of all, we're not right-wing, and global warming, climate change, and extreme weather are indeed the most existential threats into the physical civilization we have. But you may remember on last Thursday in the presidential debates when Bernie Sanders said it's one thing to talk about what a really good policy would be and make a set of ideals, but none of this is really going to matter unless you take on the vested interests. And who are the vested interests in global warming? For one thing, it's the oil industry, which is the most powerful industry economically in terms of lobbying in the United States, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And the second largest industry is the military-industrial complex. And having been a consultant on national security since the 1970s and working for the oil industry, and close the door.
Thank you.
Good. Can't make it on the national government. So I was part of the discussion. The United States already in the 70s knew about global warming. There was a national security. Large contracts were went out to say how will environmental and climate change affect American foreign policy. And a decision was made then that American foreign policy is based upon oil. If you can control the oil industry, the Americans concluded, largely with the oil industry input, then if other countries do not follow American foreign policy, you can make them freeze in the dark. And the great danger to American foreign policy, as they see it, is suppose you had other countries self-sufficient in solar energy, water energy, and non-oil resources. That meant they could all be independent of their energy policies. And being independent of an energy policy means being dependent on not only the United States, but on the U.S. oil companies and oil companies in allied countries, British Petroleum in England, the French oil industry, that essentially will treat countries like we put sanctions on Iran and on Russia. Now, the problem with this American foreign policy is that Russia also benefits from oil exports, and that explains the lobbying by the government to try to prevent Germany and other countries from carrying through on Nord Stream. America calls that dependency on Russian oil, and it wants to replace dependency on Russian oil with dependency on American oil at 2 or 3 times the price, not counting the enormous investment that America is asking Europe to make in liquefied natural gas port facilities so that they can get by ship American gas instead of oil. So I want to talk a little bit about how the U.S. foreign policy is based on opposing foreign opposition to global warming. And as I said, this. I'm going to ask for another extra 10 minutes for my talk. Since you wanted to go first, my job is to open and shut the door. Maybe you can bring peer pressure to make the people who don't shut the door feel very embarrassed. Little kids do this in 8th grade. I'm sure that you can all remember what your teachers. At any rate, what makes the oil industry so powerful? For one thing, it doesn't have to pay taxes. When I went to work for Continental Oil in the 60s, one thing as their economist, the first thing they had me and every other employer do was to write an article about why the depletion allowance is necessary. And it's necessary so that they can, whenever they deplete one oil well, they get enough money to go discover an oil well somewhere else and make a big hole in the ground and deplete that. So it's to finance the steady depletion of oil resources. That's what it is. And the other reason the oil industry doesn't have to pay taxes is the tax deductibility of interest. And finally, the oil industry developed the concept of offshore banking centers for tax avoidance. When I did a study of the balance of payments of the oil industry in 1965, the oil industry was treated like all other investments in the United States by President Johnson. And he said to finance the Vietnam War, we're imposing voluntary balance of payments controls. And that meant no country can spend more than 5% of the total value of its investment abroad increase during the year. In other words, you can't increase your foreign investment by more than 5% of what you already have. The oil industry said, we're different from all other industries. And they asked David Rockefeller to have Chase Manhattan do a study of the oil industry. And I was the balance of payments economist, so I had the job of spending a year writing it. And I looked at the statistics, and I couldn't figure it out, because why would people put into an industry that doesn't make any profit? That they have to declare, certainly. You know, it all seems to be a charitable foundation. So I asked, I looked at the statistics for the United States, foreign countries, and I went to meet with the head of Standard Oil in Rockefeller Center, and I said, where are the profits? Where are the profits made? Are they made after producing them in Saudi Arabia and other countries? Or are they made in the United States? And the man said, they're made right here in my office. I decided where to make them, and he explained what happened. We, all of the, if you look in the balance of payments, he told me there's something, there's Europe, there's Latin America, there's Asia, and there's something called international. I always wondered about that. If it's not Europe, it's not Asia, it's not Africa, Latin America, what does international mean? That means they're not really countries. They're Libya, and I'm sorry, they're Panama and Liberia that do not have their own currencies. They do not have an income tax. They use the U.S. dollar. And he said all of the oil that we buy from the producing countries, we buy at the actual cost of bringing it out, which is a couple of pennies a barrel. And the oil that we sell to the refineries and filling stations in Europe, North America, elsewhere, we sell at such a high price that they can't afford to make a profit. All the profit is made in Panama and Liberia because they don't have an income tax. And they are consolidated into the parent company, So that he said that way we don't have to pay any income tax or taxes to the third world countries, because we say, sorry, we're not making any profit there. We don't have to pay any taxes to Europe because their refineries are a public service public foundation. So essentially, that made the oil industry tax exempt, and made it by far the industry powerful enough to create the whole phenomenon of offshore banking centers and tax avoidance and tax evasion that now, since the Vietnam War, the U.S. sponsored the spread of these offshore banking centers to the Caribbean and to other countries, who created the whole idea of capital being untaxable. So that is an indication of how powerful the oil industry is. And obviously the oil industry makes its profits by producing oil and gas. Oil, when you say oil industry, that means gas and its derivatives as well. So they want to sell this at a markup. Well, the problem is that while creating this dependence on oil throughout the world, the United States wants to isolate Russia and other countries, just as it's trying to use grain exports to have other countries shift from growing their own food supply. It wants them to grow export crops and other crops that are not necessities. And the reason is that America can then try to treat them like they treated China in the 1950s, imposing an a grain embargo on countries that don't follow American foreign policy to force them to end up in surrender. That's why the United States is pressuring Europe on Nord Stream. And there's one country that I think the UN cites as the most unhappy country in the world, and that's Denmark. And they're the country that is saying, we're supporting the American military. We are opposing any imports in Russia. We want to be dependent only on American oil. So right now there's a fight within Europe over that. With Denmark, which originally during the Vietnam War, they wanted to minimize their military budget and just had a tape recorded on the military saying, we surrender. That would save them a lot of money because there's no way we could stop an invasion in case anyone is. But now they were so badly funded that the Americans came in and said, we will fund you with enormous payments to your politicians if you agree to give your loyalty to the U.S. diplomats. So the effect of this dependence on oil and climate change goes way beyond oil itself. Next to oil, water is one of the most important resources. And as you know, one of the effects of climate change is creating drought throughout the world in some areas, and flooding throughout the American Midwest in other areas. And this is especially the case with fracking, where you put huge amounts of water and sand under pressure to create Permian Basin oil and gas. And one of the great benefits of fracking is that it pollutes the water supply. This gives value to fresh water. And the oil companies have become the major investors in water. And the advantage of depending on water from drinking it out of bottles instead of having your own fresh water is the bottles are made out of plastic. And the plastic is made out of oil. So how can you lose with a game like that? So you're having America turning into an oil exporter, an oil producer, largely with fracking, creating a demand for water, creating a drought throughout the rest of the world, making other countries dependent not only on oil and energy, but on U.S. grain exports to make up for the fact that extreme weather and drought make it harder for them to fuel themselves. And the buttress of American export power in the balance of payments is agriculture, not industry. As Donald Trump points out, there's not much manufacturing going on in this country except for the military-industrial complex. So warmer air means a higher rate of evaporation. The evaporation goes into the clouds. There's more flooding in some areas, but also by the effect on climate, it changes the path of the Gulf Stream. It changes the path of, you've got to shame him. You've got to tell him to wait. Don't let him sit down. Don't let him into your room. No, tell him to leave. He's one of the asocial socialists. We have many of them at this conference, I've noticed. So Marx actually talks about a lot of this. He talked about, in I think volume 3, the excrements of production. He was talking about scrap. He was talking about pollution. In discussing productivity, he pointed out the absurdity of creating jails and hospitals and doctors as an increase in output. He said whenever people get sicker, they need more doctors and pay more for that, and the sicker they get, the more income is produced. You can find that in I think volume 3. Well, right now to the GDP, if you want the economy to grow, you really want global warming, because that results in a huge demand of cleanup costs. You have to clean up the pollution, you have to clean up the plastics, you have to rebuild the homes that are all flooded. All of this is spurring. It surprises me that none of the people who call themselves the Green Party have thought of saying, what are the externalities of the cost, and how much of the GDP actually is simply compensation and cleanup for global warming, so that it actually, what we're counting as growth, is really an increase in overhead. They haven't done that, and I think it's largely...
Bullshit! Shut up. Bullshit!
You've got to him.
That's really democratic.
No, let them know that it's directed to them, not the topic.
Thank you for your solidarity. I thought this was a left conference.
Well, as you see, we are one of the few people talking about economics here, yesterday and today, and I assume that's why this room is much more large than the green rooms in the building, where they're talking about this. The problem is, how do we pick up the thing that Bernie Sanders said? What is the point of having a policy where you say that it would be very good to have non-global warming, very good for there to be study, very good for there to be a nice environment, without saying who are the blockages of this environment, and without taking on the blockages. I had quite a problem with this in Iceland, in dealing with the Green Party there, where they brought over the main American lobbyist for the banks, Paul Krugman, to say that Iceland should follow the British Labour Party and bail out the corrupt British affiliates of the Icelandic banks. The Green Party was all in favor of it. Fortunately, they were, over this issue, they were voted out of power. Voted out of power because the Green Party was supporting the banks, not the environment, and not the people. The same problem has occurred in Germany. It's occurred in other countries. And so, as you've seen, there seems to be the left wants to work with the Greens to the extent that you agree that global warming is a problem. And that's why we're all here. But if one group of us are not willing to do what it takes to solve the problem, and not saying who is causing the problem and who benefits from the problem, you have to realize that from the point of view of American diplomacy, there are very great benefits of global warming and instability, and that's because they believe that America can suffer less than other countries and actually become the great beneficiaries of this. And I think that's what makes our analysis Marxist, meaning economic, when most economists treat global warming as an externality, meaning external to their models, meaning it doesn't take account of that, and it treats pollution as an increase in GDP, not as what it should be, a subterfuge for growth.
Can you repeat the last sentence, that last word you used?
Subtraction.
Subtraction.
Excuse me, you'll have a chance to ask questions in your brief comments shortly. Please wait until
Can anybody explain what he just said?
please wait until the speakers have a chance to talk, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions and make comments.
Okay, I want to make a few brief remarks on the question of climate change. I want to preface it with a couple of statements. The first is that if you've been in and around environmental issues for a rather long time, and one of the things that I've resisted would be some of the apocalyptic language in which the environmental question is posed. I think apocalyptic visions of the end of humanity, the end of nature, all those kinds of things are not helpful. Having said that, however, I do take the climate change and environmental questions very seriously. And in the midst of this, there is a question of how serious should we take these questions. On climate change, I have a graph, and I hope to put it up here, but you can't figure out how this technology works, of the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. This is something that's constructed by NOAA. It is the best information that we have. What that shows is that throughout these 800,000 years, carbon concentrations have varied from 150 parts per million to 300 parts per million. That's the peak. And the peak has occurred various times, about 7 or 8 times over those 800,000 years. We're very near the peak right now, except over the last 15 years, the carbon concentrations have gone from 300 to 400 parts per million, according to the graph, which suggests that something's happened over the last 15 years which breaks through what might be considered the peak point of natural variation into something which is completely different and completely new. Yesterday, one of the points I was making, and I'll make it again here, is that we should look very carefully at the mass of concentrations. And the mass of concentration now of carbon dioxide, if that graph is correct, and I can't see any reason why it would not be, it would say that the mass of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already are sufficient to do very considerable damage to the Earth's climate over the next few years, so that even though I'm anti-apocalyptic, I think there is something that needs to be looked at in this huge surge over the last 15 years, and ask the question, where and why did that surge occur? The second thing I would want to say is this, that, as I think we've already sensed, the environmental question draws a whole variety of people into the conversation who come from very different political backgrounds, different forms of aesthetic judgment, different politics. And so it's very hard to kind of say there's an environmental issue and we all have the same view of it, because that is absolutely not the case. There's an eco-socialist view, there's an eco-feminist view, there are deep ecology views, there are all sorts of diverse views. And one of the things I noted in a book I wrote some time ago was that all proposals about the environment are to some degree or other proposals about how to reshape society. And you cannot talk about the environmental issue without actually connecting it very much to the social issue. Now, contra Michael, I think there will have been periods when the Greens have been very aware, I think, of this relationship between social questions and the ecological questions, and therefore the issue is to try to put together the social and the ecological into some kind of configuration. But the mission here that Bertell is interested in, and I try to speak to, not very expertly, is the issue of what the Marxists have to say about this, what would Marxist ecology look like. Historically, Marxism and the the chief forms of its administrative action in environmentalism, which would be communism and so on, have not had a very, very good record taking environmental questions that seriously. I've been involved in this for some time, and back in the late 60s, early 70s, I found many sort of people coming out of the Marxist political parties, if I started to talk about ecological questions, would basically immediately dismiss me as some sort of petty bourgeois romanticist. In fact, there have been some very signal influences on my thinking about this, because there was a wonderful movement in Australia called the Green Band movement, which had the construction unions refuse to construct anything which did not have decent ecological or environmental impact. That movement was a very strong movement, and as you probably know, it's very difficult to get construction unions and to go against developmentalism and so on, and to get them to take the environmental issue that seriously. In this case, they did. But their position was actually destroyed by a combination of the main state apparatus plus the leadership, the national leadership of the union, which was Maoist. And it was the Maoists who played the fiercest role. And of course, during much of the Soviet era, and maybe we can talk about this, there was a tendency to approach the question of nature as a Promethean kind of domination question, that nature was just there to be used and exploited. Therefore, the Stalin period was not very friendly towards environmental questions, with all sorts of disastrous consequences. This was not true necessarily in the early years of the Soviet Union, when it seems that there were movements towards conservation and the like. So there was an interesting period when this was taken seriously, but the Stalin period was absolutely appalling. And since then, there's been, I think, a tendency within the left, within the Marxist communist kind of realm, not to go anywhere close to it. Now that has changed over the last 20, 30 years, beginning with Jim O'Connor and some of the work that he did, and then passing through the work of some of the people associated with Monthly Review, like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett and the like. So we do now have a corpus of writing on environmental questions, which of course has also been added to by the work of we geographers who, on the left, try to discuss questions of the production of nature and the critique of the production of nature and the like. Within the history of on the left, however, the Frankfurt School had a very strong critique of the domination of nature argument, and so there was some dissent which was coming from that quarter, and it was that dissent which was picked up by some of the early movements of the German Greens. The German Greens have an interesting history in that way. I think it is rather sad to see the way they have actually drifted very much more towards the right in recent years. But what do we do then vis-a-vis all of these other ideas about environment? I mean, somebody like Michael Bloomberg does take the environment seriously and does argue for a kind of corporatist approach to environmental questions, which I don't, something obviously I would not share, but it is a serious attempt to look at the climate change and other issues. So how would I then approach the question of climate change? And to me then, this then says, why would I do that? And I think the answer is, I want to know why this concentration of carbon dioxide has gone up from 300 parts to 400 parts per million over a period of about 10 years. What happened? What was it that did that? And in what ways can we therefore draw lessons from that in terms of what to do about the climate change question and how we might approach it? There is, I think, one simple answer to this question. That around 2005 and so on, start to see is a developmental process at work within the terrain of capitalism, but particularly a developmental process concentrated in China, which was a rapid urbanization, super rapid urbanization, super rapid kind of construction, super reconfiguration of Chinese society in a massive, truly massive development project. And this massive development project crystallized and became very, very powerful in the global economy after the crash of 2007, 2008. Because in 2007, 2008, China saw its export markets crash. It was faced with 30 million unemployed, and it had to put it to work. It did not have an internal consumerist structure so that it could actually draw in and supplement and, if you like, substitute the Chinese consumer for the US consumer. So it did what it could do, which is to go into the realm of what Marx calls productive consumption, which is investment in infrastructures, investment in urbanization, and we have this huge urbanization project to the point where China is again preparing to construct cities which actually configure about 130 million people. So you can imagine one city of 130 million people, and this is something the Chinese are really thinking about and trying, I think, to reconfigure. Now, the consequence of this has been, of course, a huge uptick in construction and a huge increase in particularly cement production. If I had the graph here, I'd show you the cement production thing, which is absolutely phenomenal. Because what, in effect, you see is that China consumed in about 2.5 years about 45% more cement than the United States consumed in 100 years. So you see the graph of cement consumption in the United States, which is going on like this. And in 2007, 2008, the graph of cement consumption in the United States went down very significantly because a lot of construction projects were stopped. But in China, the whole cement went way. Huge. And this is what I call, the transformation scale here is something which is very, very significant. Because that's that transformation scale which begins to then connect you to greenhouse gas emissions coming from China, which are pretty steady up until around 2005. They start to grow a bit, and then after 2007, 2008, they kind of go en masse. So what I've been doing here is suggesting to you that there's a connectivity between this development growth model that occurred in China at that time and that surge in greenhouse gas emissions, because it also turns out the cement production also creates a good deal of greenhouse gases. And that is maybe perhaps the reason why we saw that huge uptick in the global data on CO2 concentrations. Now, you then kind of say, okay, well, here we are in a country, particularly the United States, where it seems like everybody wants to blame China for everything. And is that what I'm doing? My answer is no, it's not what I'm doing. Because what China did saved global capitalism. China single-handedly saved the whole goddamn capitalist system. When you get that into your head, you realize that actually that greenhouse gas emissions thing is not attributable to China, it's attributable to a certain state of the global capitalist economy. And the state of the global capitalist economy underwent a crisis, and its motive coming out of the crisis was indeed to foster a developmental project, and that developmental project which saved the system and turned it around was focused in China. It was not focused in this country, it was not focused in Europe, it was not focused elsewhere. Actually, it's kind of interesting. Since 2007, 2008, China has contributed more to the development of the global economy than than North America, Europe, and Japan combined. About 30 to 35% of the growth has come from China. China alone. And that Chinese growth, of course, has implications for all sorts of other things. If you're going to build things around the country, you're going to need to increase steel capacity, aluminum capacity, copper production capacity, extraction of minerals around the world. And so when we start to look at the data on the absorption of minerals into the production stream, you see a huge increase in copper output and copper production. You see a huge increase in steel production. Most of it, again, attributable to what's happening in China. There's now, of course, a big argument in the press kind of saying maybe China's over-accumulated. Several times over the last 20 years, people have said China's over-accumulated and they're going to crash, and they never do, so maybe they will this time. So there's this connectivity, and this is where I get back to, if you like, the basic way in which I would try to analyse what the role of climate change is in relationship to the dynamics of capital accumulation. And that seems to me to be the core of the issue. And the reason why this is important is because so many people in the environmental world refuse to take an anti-capitalist position. Michael Bloomberg does not take an anti-capitalist position. Many people in the kind of ecology movement are actually anti-Marxist and refuse to be in the anti-capitalist camp. And I think this is a very important moment historically in where the left is at. And this is not only on the environmental issue, it's also on everything else. Like I'm very kind of impressed with just reading this book by Cynthia Rowlands, Titi Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser on feminism for the 99%. And the point they're making is that feminism over the years has partly been absorbed into the neoliberal project, and that there has to be an anti-capitalist feminism, and it should be clearly distinct from the kind of Hillary Clinton feminism and the corporatist feminism that is around, and it's a very, very strong statement as to why that should be the case. And what we should be doing as Marxists is to make it very clear that there is no way that you can do anything about this climate change. There's no way you can really do anything major about any of these major environmental issues. And it's not only climate change, it's habitat destruction, species destruction, there's a whole range of things. There's no way you're going to be able to do that without actually organising ourselves into an anti-capitalist movement. And that seems to me to be what the mission we should do. We should try to use clear Marxist analysis in a way that actually engages in that project. And as part of this project, I would argue the way I sort of set it up is that I tend to look at the whole kind of framing that Marx set out in the 3 volumes of Capital and say, well, Marx was there analysing in detail, great detail, what is going on in the relationships between production, realisation and distribution. But there's a set of contextual conditions which Marx points to but does not develop. And one of those contextual conditions is the metabolic relation to nature. And what Marx kind of says is that the metabolic relation to nature is always present, no matter what mode of production you're looking at. And this is where you then get back to sort of some of the are there, however, metabolic relations which are specific to a capitalist mode of production. And this seems to me to be also something that we really need to be looking at, and I think that there's a good case to be made that the metabolic relation to nature is being transformed radically through the kinds of processes that I'm looking at in China, and can be looked at historically, if you like, even way back to the first Manchester factories, which spewed out all of those all of that smoke, and all of that smoke when it all drifted over the Pennines and it came down as acid deposition, and all the Pennine peat bogs died. And of course later on we have the acid deposition kind of problem that all of the British power stations, which have been given these very high plumes to sort of chuck all of the sulphur up into the upper atmosphere, and the air quality in Britain and London got much cleaner, and then suddenly the Swedes started finding all of their lakes were becoming acidified, and they were all dying because that's where the acid rain was coming down. Now, we've seen examples of this kind, and actually, historically, I think we should look at some of the ways in which negotiations over how to treat those examples work. We have the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with CFCs. Again, this is some things which are limited kind of examples. But if this increase in CO2 from 300 to 400 is really true and it becomes the case, it is absolutely the case that within 50 years or so, probably most of Antarctica will be melted away, most of Greenland ice cap, Himalayas will have lost their snowpack, leaving whole of South India, or the Indian subcontinent, bereft of its major source of water supply. I mean, these, you know, I don't want to get into a sort of an apocalyptic tale, but it seems to me if it goes up to 400, and it's never been at 400 throughout the last 800,000 years, and this is not just simply just a little bit over 300, going from 300 to 400 is something huge, and that mass is going to slowly, over the next 50, 100 years, dissolve most of the ice that is around, and that happens. Now, there are all sorts of consequences that are going to flow from that. So at this moment, I would reverse myself from some of the former presentations I would have made around this subject and say, okay, I'm not being apocalyptic about this, this is just a predictable fact. Yeah, this is indeed the case. Now, if this is the case, then we have to start to argue what kinds of ways can we find that can do something about this. Because the issue now is not stopping carbon emissions, important that it is. What the mission right now has to be to get at least 100 parts per million out of the atmosphere before it does the damage which it's now doing, which is a huge project of geoengineering. And then you ask the question, how can that be done? And then you can say, well, actually, how was all that carbon put underground in the first place? What put it there? It wasn't as if, we had kind of somebody coming along with the geoengineering project and said, let's just store all there in that place. No, they didn't do that. But it was plants and animals that did it over millions of years. And they have the capacity to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But then what do they do with it? A tree, for example, will just put it in the tree. And the tree will be, but the tree will absorb it up until the point where the tree becomes mature, where it no longer absorbs it. And then, of course, when the tree dies and it all falls down and decays, it releases it. So it's kind of, so forestation is good. But one other thing to do is to try to find forms of agriculture which take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it underground. And there are crops that do that. Now this is going to mean a complete global compact on agriculture and a complete revitalization of agriculture. Now, here too, there are some things going on right now which are interesting. Given surplus productive capacity, many European farmers are paid not to produce. And even we see some of that going on in this country. Well, where they could be paid to actually grow those kinds of crops without necessarily using them, those kinds of crops, which put the stuff underground. But we have to start on that now. And there has to be a technical, political, economic project which is going to do that, which, by the way, will play a very important role in the revitalization of that area of rural life, which has been suffering terribly for economic reasons over the last 20 or 30 years. So I think right now, from a Marxist perspective, I would want to kind of try to create an analysis of where the problem lies, and then start to think about ways of approaching it. And obviously, as I've already kind of indicated, and we can take this up more in discussion, to start to think about anti-capitalist strategies. Anti-capitalist strategies which clearly are going to be able to address a particular problem, which it now seems to me is at a level and at a stage where it really has to be a priority to address it. Okay, thank you.
And most of you will not have heard, so I just want to just mention it. If you feel good about something that really is important, I think. And that is that just a few days ago, I ran across a magazine I don't ordinarily look at called Teen Vogue, which is published for teenagers by Vogue magazine, and has 3.3 million Twitter followers. And they've just published a very positive article on Karl Marx. Thought that would be a nice.
Did you write it?
I did write it, but it was very good. Okay, my talk today deals with a much, much less positive development. Runaway climate change, most of which is a new subject for me. And to keep it manageable, I'm afraid I will have to read a lot of it, and for that I apologize. Well, the question with which I begin is, what is the relation between Marx's emphasis on what Lukács referred to as, quote, the all-pervasive supremacy of the whole over the parts, unquote, which lies at the core of Marx's dialectics, and climate change? Or, how does the former, that is dialectics, help us understand both who and what are responsible for climate change that the entire planet is now undergoing, and how would understanding that increase our chances of doing something effective about it? These are the questions I will try to answer in this talk. Most of you will have already read and heard and worried a good deal about climate change, but you may be asking, what does that have to do, if anything, with Marx's dialectics, and vice versa? Part of this problem here is that the majority of Marx's followers don't really understand dialectics very well, or openly reject it. But that only makes it impossible for them to use it in dealing with the problem at hand. It also makes it necessary for me to offer a brief clarification of what Marx's dialectic is and isn't, before moving on to its relation with climate change. A friend of mine, Raju Das, sent me some lines from the English poet Percy Shelley that provides just the right context for what is to follow. The poem is called Love's Philosophy, and it reads, quote, the fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single, all things by a law divine, in one spirit meet and mingle, why not I with thine? Unquote. I'll spare you the second half of the poem, though it's just as good and deals with the same thing. We learn here that nothing in the world is single, in quotes, but that everything is connected and interacting with one another in one way or another. In this approach, it is the whole, that has priority over the parts that make it up, and supplies the latter with their place and the main functions that go with it. Marx also held to a version of this view, as did Hegel, Spinoza, and Leibniz, the main philosophers from whom he got it. So there is nothing unique or even that unusual in Marx subscribing to what has been called, quote, the philosophy of internal relations, unquote. It is how he used it, which was to analyze the workings of capitalism, of course, that makes Marxism stand out as much as it does. It is only in the last century, with the collusion of most of the academy throughout the capitalist world, that the philosophy of internal relations has been almost completely replaced by a philosophy of external relations that treats the parts of anything, and often a single part, as the only legitimate object of study. With this approach, most of the connections between disciplines, let alone within each one, are trivialized, if not completely ignored. While privileging the influence of the whole over its multitudinous parts, Marx, on the other hand, was constantly involved in tracing the connections in and between disciplines as they developed, are developing, and are likely to develop. For him, they are all internally related as aspects of one another, either directly or indirectly, and even very indirectly. And it is in this way of thinking about the world, as well as studying it, and finally putting what he learned into practice. It is all this that finds its way into Marx's understanding of dialectics, which brings me now to climate change. If everything in the world is internally related, then an approach like dialectics, which starts with that assumption, is likely to do a much better job in uncovering the numerous factors that have gone into climate change than any of the alternatives, which tend to focus on only one or a few of the climatic factors that are disrupting our lives. There are, of course, important exceptions, but they too are partial and leave out too much that is relevant compared to the much bigger picture that Marx's dialectics brings together. It has been suggested by some critics of this approach that connecting everything that is internally related could go on forever. What is to stop it? What stops it is that the dialectic we have been describing contains a second important step, the process of abstraction, or focusing on and privileging elements of the whole that serve Marx as takeoff points from which to examine as much of the rest as he believes is relevant for the problems at hand. This should not be surprising, since focusing on what is of special interest to us is something we all do, and with all 5 of our senses. Moreover, we have been doing it since shortly after birth, though few have understood it as well or developed the degree of skill in using it as Karl Marx. The main step in this process is to study the workings of capitalism from several different vantage points. This is key. The main step in this process is to study the workings of capitalism from several different vantage points, the most important of which are production, class, capital, alienation, value, and metamorphosis. Given that all these entries into our subject, different vantage points from which to view and analyze capitalism, given that all these entries into our subject are internally related, they can also be viewed as overlapping conditions for constructing what is essentially the same whole. Marx's dialectics also contains all of this. Besides the philosophy of internal relations and the process of abstraction, Marx's dialectics has still a third dimension, which is usually referred to as the dialectical laws. These laws are sufficiently general to apply to everything, everywhere, and always, which is usually enough to keep them from being taken seriously by people who were trained to restrict their research to the bits and pieces of any problem, which includes, as we know, practically everyone in the U.S. with a university degree. Probably the best known of these laws are contradiction, quantity, quality, change, essence and appearance, and negation of the negation. If the first and most important dimension of dialectics emphasizes internal relations, and the second one, the process of abstraction, shows how internal relations can be broken up to deal with any given problem, the dialectical laws, or third dimension of dialectics, is concerned with the movement and changes, whether observable or not, that take place at one speed or another, even very slowly, in everything. Together, these three dimensions provide Marx with a way of thinking about and studying anything without losing sight of the relations, including the indirect relations and the changes over time that characterize them. What badly needs to happen now is to let dialectics, as I've just summarized it, in all three of these dimensions, loose on the main problems associated with climate change. In a conference such as this, the most I can do is to offer a few examples in the hope that some of the people here will recognize the value of such an approach and try to incorporate it into both their thinking and practice. The first question to ask, coming out of what I've just been describing, is how, coming from what we have just gone over, is what it would mean to begin a study of climate change from the vantage point of the whole, which is where Marx began his study of everything. Well, as a starter, it would single out the kind of world in which so much climate change is going on. And today, that is almost entirely a capitalist world. One of the most striking things that almost all the discussions of climate change have in common is that capitalism is hardly ever mentioned. Yet, the most striking character of capitalism throughout its 200 plus years of history is its willingness to sacrifice everyone and everything in its single-minded focus to maximize profits. And that includes the land, the water, and the air that surrounds most capitalist enterprises. Except these natural conditions were so plentiful, and for a long time, the enterprises themselves were so small and so few that it took almost 200 years for them to arrive at the present state of affairs. In short, one must go back even further than the middle of the last century and see that capitalism had been doing these things from the very start for the reasons I gave. Readers will note that by inserting the problem we need to understand into a much broader space, that is the entire capitalist world, as well as a much longer time, that is the last 200 years, I've also tried to illustrate what a dialectical description would look like. As for the natural scientists who write so much about climate change today, they can certainly explain what is happening on the surface of events and even measure how things have gotten worse in recent years. Given their one-sided education, however, most of them have little, if any, idea of who and what is responsible for it. And most of their solutions are trivial. The widespread practice of blaming humanity for climate change, adding that we must all change our lifestyles, gets us a little closer to the solution because we aren't. The same holds for expecting the governments of this world to make the needed changes before it's too late. Even though there are people in many of the governments who would like to do so, but with very few exceptions, they don't know what that would require. The problem here is that capitalism, especially since it has become a worldwide system, has become the dominant influence in the media, in education, in entertainment, in sports, in what gets produced and sold everywhere, and with all of this, also in the governments of the world, in all of the governments of the world. For it is the capitalists who let their government know what they want and need from them, with few exceptions, and with few exceptions. The opposite, that is to say, the government tries to get the capitalists to do something that the capitalists would rather not do. In this situation, it is capitalism, the system of capitalism, which has its tentacles everywhere, that is responsible for climate change, and not the workers or the students, or even most of the legislators who have to carry out the boss's orders in order to keep their jobs. Understanding what is really going on here and what must be done quickly to have any chance of avoiding the worst of what is just around the corner is to recognize that the workers who are turning out all the junk, that is, whatever the capitalists are asking them to produce, are not deciding to do so. It is the bosses, the capitalists who decide, who tell them what to do, and of course, they decide on the basis of what will maximize their profits. They don't do this because they're selfish, though of course many of them are, but largely because of their intense competition with other capitalists in their industry, where reduced profits often lead to going out of business. The capitalists have always treated their workers as badly as they could get away with, and the same holds for the conditions in which work goes on, both in the workplace, in the city, and the country where people live. And now, of course, in the entire world. It is the capitalist system as such that is at the roots of the problems associated with climate change. The biggest takeaway from this analysis is that the capitalist class as a whole and everywhere are not only contributing to climate change, which we should really call climate crisis, but the main cause of it, and that for easily over 100 years. And including in this is not only the climate, I'm including in this, not only the climate deniers such as Trump, but those who recognize and help finance the climate crisis. Even though they do that, they are also contributing and doing their best to obfuscate how serious the problem is and keep the actions as minimal as possible. People like Al Gore, for example. And I'm almost finished. Three main reasons that the capitalists have been able to get away with this so far are: one, they managed to have climate change viewed practically by everyone as a problem for governments to deal with, when it is they who control most of the world's governments. This takes the heat off them while they continue to despoil the planet. Two, they also own and control the media, the schools, the courts, etc., where the bigger picture that is discussed earlier, and the use of capitalism as a key vantage point from which to examine our biggest problem right now, which is the climate crisis, is simply unavailable. The way of thinking about this in the right way is unavailable to most of the people around the world. The third effect that they're having, and I think this is the most important one, maybe the one where we can have a lot more lobbyist role to play, the third great advantage the capitalists have in the colossal struggle now going on between them and us is that a large section of the working class supports them, which gives the capitalists the numbers they need to continue to pollute the planet. Is there a way we can turn this around? I want to suggest that the main reason this strange alliance, is a myth. That is to say, it's happening, but the reason for it is a myth. That one, that most workers, but also almost everybody else in the capitalist world believes, which may make, by the way, this myth the most powerful myth in the history of the world. And this myth is that that the wealth of society, this is the myth, the wealth of society starts with a decision by a capitalist to hire workers to produce a certain commodity. The workers do it and hand it over to the capitalist who pays them a certain wage for their help. Told in this way, it appears that the capitalist who pays them the capitalists are essential. It's the capitalists who are essential for all this wealth and for all the other wealth that gets produced in the world. And that without their hiring the workers, there would be no wealth. This is, of course, just the opposite. It's not the workers who need the capitalists for there to be wealth. It's the capitalists who need the workers for them to get a share, any share, let alone the biggest share, of the wealth that is created. The point is that while capitalists need workers, workers don't need the capitalists. Most workers, of course, don't believe this because it's not what they see happening all around them every day. And this is true not only for those who are trying to maximize their profits, but for literally all capitalists. The strange alliance that the workers have, not all workers obviously, but too many for most of us to believe when it first started happening. The strange alliance that represents has less to do with the nationalism and racism that is usually trotted out as the main reasons that so many workers have supported capitalist parties in the recent past. This is not the main reason. It's the objective conditions in which the workers work and get the orders to work and get a part of what they produce and think that the capitalist deserves the rest because they began the process. Well, what is to be done? First, I would mix the criticism of capitalism that was laid out above as being responsible for climate change, and that could be done. By. I would make the criticism of capitalism the kind that I just laid out could be made, because this is what would help people see that there's an alternative way, not just of making goods, but of sharing them. And this would enable the workers to see that it would be possible, since there's so much wealth that is being created, to get much more of that wealth, and not only get much more of that wealth, but to actually work less in getting it. That is to say, the time of work could be reduced, and the wealth that workers get for creating that much of whatever is being produced would be greater than they got before, and they would be in a much stronger position to affect their lives, and of course, among those things, to take care of the climate. Now, this sounds like the beginnings of communism, I guess it is. Marx Marx obviously was too optimistic about how long it would take for the capitalist world to produce as much wealth as it is being produced today, and therefore to make possible this kind of transition, major change of who gets most of it. Now, unfortunately, now that this has occurred, the same capitalism is threatening the conditions necessary that are coming into being that would likely sooner or later, and probably sooner than later, make not just human but animal and all plant life on the planet impossible. But another way of looking at this, but this comes to an end. Another way of looking at this is that given the very threat that climate change poses to everybody on the planet today, it could actually have an effect of getting people to see some of the illusions which the capitalist has fostered that makes for the kind of divisions in the wealth produced and the power that goes with that I've been describing here. And therefore to set out, that is to say, so far as people can see through what I've called the greatest myth in the history of our species, this might get enough of them to turn around to begin to act in ways which bring about the changes, and the only kinds of changes, that is to say, by getting rid of capitalism, that will get rid of the enormous dangers, which I think have only been touched on here. I think my own view of them is that they're much worse than even that have been suggested by the first two speakers. But this is the only way I think that getting rid of capitalism much sooner than much later is the only way we're going to save the planet and people on it. Now, there's a question. First, let me say that I think maybe dialectics, as I described it, can play an important role in making this transition, because it would take some dialectical thinking, which is never taught to workers as far as I know. Although some workers pick up some of it, but I think that dialectical thinking could really help workers make this kind of transition in their thinking. Now, am I being too optimistic? I see some people may be surprised, may think that. Possibly. But what is more important to struggle for today than the possibility of having a tomorrow?
to fill in the intermittency of their wind
and solar panels that they were putting on these roofs and in farms. It's just something to think about. The other point I wanted to make just briefly is I'm glad you brought up regenerative agriculture. Dave Harvey brought that up. In fact, the University of Nebraska did a study that all the farmers, as you said, globally adopted, it's not a question, it's a comment, adopted this form of agriculture. Every bit of CO2 ever produced by industry for the last 100 years would be sequestered into the soil. The other point, though, of that is that to do that, you need cattle to do it. You need to put cows back on the ground, back on the soil, in order to regenerate the soil. So it goes against the vegan lifestyle big time when you do that. It's just something for vegans and vegetarians.
Cows farm. Methane comes out. I don't think that's the way to go. Just to address David Harvey's point about negative carbon emissions in regenerative agriculture, as a climate scientist, that's necessary but not sufficient. The problem is that warming has already occurred. Even if we keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, the warming actually partitions the CO2 out of the soil and back in the atmosphere. We need industrial scale reaction of the crust with CO2. And this was discussed in the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal. And I would agree with Michael regarding a critique of some Green parties, but I don't think it's fair, as the previous speaker said, to label that. Now, one final point. I think we need a strategy that opens up a path to an eco-socialist transition to end the rule of capital. And that's, I think, really needs to be addressed. I'd like your comments on that.
Thank you. I'm Alexander Kuzgarin from Moscow State University. I came from Russia, and I received 2 minutes from Bertell, so big present. I think general questions are extremely important, and Marxist approach can give us the tool. First of all, we have productive forces category. Let's put question. What kind of productive forces are dirty? What kind of productive forces are green, clean? Let's make visible, simple answer. Complex answer, first. Second, what kind of production relations generate dirty productive forces? For whom it is profitable to create dirty productive forces, dirty technologies, and so on. What kind of production relations helps to receive profit from dirty productive forces and to make Earth even more dirty than it was before? And Michael said partly the answer on this question. But when we generalize, this is very beautiful, or better to say ugly picture, how this capital creates this system. And it will be very visible. Next question, more detailed. What kind of fractions of capital will help to increase pollution, and what fractions of capital can be, in some aspects, may be the forces which will clean a little bit our Earth. Again, maybe in a little bit and so on. Next step, social forces. This is pure Marxist analysis. For what kind of social forces growth of environmental problem is profitable and useful and creates more power for them? There are a lot of such social strategies for whom this is very good. Why people are against and what kind of people are against? The answer will be not so simple. Political picture. Why we have political parties and organizations who will say blah 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 about green questions, but really they will create just simulacra of green policy. Why it is profitable for these political forces to create simulacra of green policy? Why they are doing this? It will be very visible again to show how it works. Next question, I am finishing. What kind of, really 30 seconds, what kind of changes we can realize through reforms. And what kind of reforms? Reforms can be very deep and very difficult. And what kind of ecological problems we never will solve without revolution. That's it. Thank you. As a way of finding a round table about this, you can take information on the table.
Thank you. So, Michael, who do you think is opposing pipelines all over the country? Who is opposing fracking? Who's opposing nuclear power? Who's opposing GMOs? You know, there's been green activists in the streets and in all these places. And for you to denigrate, who's been going to jail on these for using tear gas? All over the place because they're opposing the oil companies. You know, it hasn't been, I won't say what hasn't been, but it has been green activists all over the place. And for you to denigrate us is just bullshit. Who do you think was in Seattle in 1999 working with workers to try and create a blue-green alliance and working on that? You know, it was green activists in the streets of Seattle in 99 around the issue of GMOs in Africa that created a huge difference. You know, how do we do it? I mean, it's not really a mystical question. I mean, it's true that I'm a Marxist, but haven't been thinking much of how do we do it. So it's good that you're raising it, David, but the answers are out there. So when you expose Monsanto for funding the fucking coups against Venezuela, it's easier for environmental activists to then see what's the connection for Monsanto, GMOs in Venezuela, because Venezuela is one of the only countries in the world that has banned GMOs. So when you put that together, you make that bridge, and it's not a difficult bridge. And people move. Who's in the streets against the anti-war movement? Every single green activist I know was in the streets in anti-war movement in the U.S. And in terms of Germany, Joschka Fischer, who the hell, who was supporting the wars, the U.S. war, he was the green activist who became the equivalent of Secretary of State. It was the green activist who hit him with red paint, who denounced him, who opposed him, and who built a different type of way of approaching stuff and exposed them. So this way of thinking, I think, is really, really terrible.
Someone here had, a woman had, yes.
Excuse me, I came from Paris. I am a yellow vest, and I don't speak very well English. Excuse me. But I want to tell you about.
Why don't you go to the microphone? Go to the podium.
I want to tell you, when revolution is in the process, all the questions become very simple, and the poor people, the working class, understand everywhere all the questions, all the issues. Now, every Saturday we are on the street, and we say the end of month and the end of the world is the same issue, is the same question. You know, these people are in the street, not in intelligentsia, the poor people, the working people, and we are building now a democracy direct, you know, and we are building assembly, local association about building a future for a world more equitable, more fair, etc., etc. Please, you have to understand we are in process in the real revolution. Perhaps the process lasts some months, some years, but it's irréversible. Nous sommes en train de construire une révolution réelle, semaine après semaine. Soyez-en sûrs. Aidez-nous. Merci beaucoup.
The last sentence she said in French. Can I translate it for her? Yeah. For you guys? She said that week after week they are in the middle of a revolution. And if we do not get involved in that revolution, everybody's going to be left behind. And we are not going to make any changes if we want to attack this capitalist system that is causing poverty after poverty all over the world. We are not going to make any changes. And they are asking for us to be aware and be part of the revolution that is happening in France. So don't leave them alone. That's what they're saying. That's what she just did.
So just a brief comment, I'll be very brief. So in 2017, the Trump administration dissolved the interagency working group, which was tasked with coming up with this metric called the social cost of carbon. And they put in these interim estimates, which were basically between $1 to $6 for every ton of carbon dioxide emitted. It was previously priced at around $25. That was the central estimate. Both of those estimates are far, far lower than what the latest research shows, which is probably on the order of $400-some per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So if you're wondering why we were seeing, despite the fact that we were aware of the dangers associated with carbon dioxide emission, the reason why it's continuing to be emitted at record levels is because it's essentially free to emit. There's no social cost involved, and that's how it's priced. And I think any sort of leftist answer needs to emphasize the social cost of carbon, that it's much, much higher than we're estimating it right now.
Mr. Bill Spring Party, Maryland. Are you aware that the main block of return of carbon to the soil are insecticides, chemical farming? That's the main thing returning the carbon to the earth. Not only does the insecticides, which is in widespread use around the world, kill organisms above the ground, it kills the organisms in the soil, which not only reduces the food value of the food that we eat, but it stops the return of carbon to the earth. Monsanto, Bayer are the enemies of humanity. They have to be stopped.
We'll take one more question, we'll have some responses, and we'll have more questions. Yes, we'll two more questions. Okay, go ahead. Here, please, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Adam Corral. I'm coming from Hungary, but I've been in America for 50 years or so. And I'd like to come back to a practical question. Everybody, the speakers seem to agree that capitalism is not going and doesn't want to solve the environmental problem, at least not before the totally catastrophic.
Could you speak up a bit?
So I think the speakers and most of us agree that capitalism is not going to solve, does not intend to solve the environmental problem seriously. Okay, now the point seems to be to argue this point. To me, this is the final proof that anti-capitalism is the thing to do. And how do you do it? Is there a strategy to convince the Russian who still has drinkable water coming from the tap, to convince him to be in solidarity with the African who walks towards...
Okay, enough.
Excuse me, sorry, thank you. We're going to have a few responses, and then we'll have one question. Unless Michael wants to have a response to whatever he said by others, including the others. Yeah.
Okay, I can see the argument over here, and it's about what really is opposition to the global warming, and what can you all do to stop the climate crisis. There is a difference between an effective and an ineffective response to the global crisis. And the point that I was trying to make is the key to it is economic. It's not simply talking about carbon in the atmosphere. It's not simply tracing, look, there's global warming, how are we going to get through it? It's economic. That's the common theme. And that's why David pointed out that there is a petty bourgeois romantic view of, well, my way of coping with global warming is going to be to cut my carbon footprint, which is all very good. There's one common denominator, apart from being Marxist, that we all have, the three of us have. We're all in our 80s. And that meant that 50 years ago, 60 years ago, we tried working with other groups, what were then called bourgeois groups, and again, whenever we would try to actually solve, work towards a solution that they were doing, they said, oh no, we can't criticize the vested interests, or oh no, that's against American foreign policy. And if you're absorbed by a party that is not leftist, I mean, this is called the left form. It's not called the bourgeois, petty bourgeois romantic form. There's a tendency of working with these guys again and again. They'll be like Lucy with the football, taking it away from you. You think you can depend upon them, and then they'll say, well, we've got to go forward by making a compromise. Our compromise is not to talk about economics, not to talk about anything controversial. And the fact is, economics is controversial. With regard, one person mentioned the protesting of the pipelines. The pipelines are indeed an awful thing. In 1976, the Carter administration hired me as the economist for the Alberta tar sands. And it takes 10 gallons of water to make every gallon of oil under the Alberta tar sands. The Carter administration said, this is wonderful. We'll divert water from the United States to make oil. That will cause a drought in the Midwest. It'll push up our grain export prices, and we can get, now that OPEC countries have quadrupled the price for oil, we will quadruple the price of food. And as an extra, the Southerners said, as an extra benefit, we get to starve half of Africa. This was what the U.S. government was saying. So you have to look at, it's one thing to say we are for global warming, it's another thing to say who are the people that are benefiting from the climate crisis, and if you don't go cut out the beneficiaries, and this is not something the oil companies want to hear, it's not something the Green Party wants to hear. Again and again, you're going to just find yourself...
That's just wrong. Well, where were you getting that from?
I'm getting it from Iceland, from Germany, from America.
You're in America here right now. You let him speak.
Well, this is a tendency that we're finding in all countries. I spend quite a bit of time in Germany. I find it there. You can't imagine the arguments. For instance, if you drive all around Berlin, you'll have, there's a lot of windmills everywhere for trying to get wind energy that are really, really noisy. You don't want to live near a windmill. I think in New England they're trying to put windmills up in the sea. It's really a problem there.
You used Margaret Flowers' name. It wasn't about Iceland. You attacked Margaret Flowers here. You used her name.
No, I did. I did not attack Margaret Flowers.
Yes, you did.
No, what I said was at this very moment while we are having the meeting here in a big room, she's in a little room in another building, and that shows the balance in this conference over where people are mainly concerned. Why isn't she here? I'm just saying that there's a difference between her in that building and we in this building. I want to say something about the other question that was raised about agriculture. This is very important. This problem was brought up already in the 1840s. I published a book, America's Protectionist Takeoff, and in that book, I have a whole chapter on how the Whigs at that time wanted to take into account soil pollution and the effect of America's export, plantation exports on soil depletion, and to work that into the trade balance in the national accounts. They were absolutely opposed by the Democrats at that time, representing the slave interest in the United States. And on the 100th anniversary of the Department of Agriculture, I wanted to point out that for 10 years before the Lincoln administration came in and created the Department of Agriculture, the Whigs were trying to do this. The farmers absolutely opposed any Department of Agriculture because they opposed any calculation of the soil pollution and the destruction caused by plantation farming. This was a central argument for 10 years, and so all of the Whig agricultural policies had to be published in Volume 2 of the annual patent reports every year. Only the Patent Office could take accounting of all this. So there's, and this attitude that you had by the Democrats back in the 1840s is still alive in mainstream economics when they treat soil pollution, environmental decay as exogenous, not part of their models, and therefore not need to be included in any calculations of GDP or economic welfare. So in order to make the points that you all want to make, you have to realize that there's a great opposition and vested interests against us, and you have to know who these vested interests are. And one of the ways that they promote their interest is by trying to divert attention away from the economic issues and the beneficiaries of the climate crisis.
So I'd like to, there's so much on the table. I want to thank you all, first off, and I'd like to poll the room, how many people here think that green capitalism is possible? I won't throw anything at you, I promise. Okay, a couple people think green capitalism. Okay, so I think it's important for us, even if we may have strategic, tactical, organizational differences, not to elevate what I call non-antagonistic contradictions up to antagonisms, right? Because if we all believe that there should be a total change in the system, and we realize it needs to be a totality change, and also realize, going back to Bertell, your talk, just as every part is determined by the whole, no part is the whole, right? There's no thing you can say or do that's going to overthrow the system. So the most important thing is that we cultivate, I would say, a culture of intellectual exchange and comradeship that really takes seriously that we're in this fucking thing together for the long haul. And then criticisms happen within that, along those lines. So my question for you, also for Bertell, is to come back to the point you made about the objective basis of worker alienation, right? Rather than, you were very kind of quick at the end there for lack of time. It's not enough to blame the racism, sexism, misogyny, nationalism of workers to account for their kind of lack of resistance. But it's objective basis of alienation, right, which I hear is Capital Volume 1, right, the appearance of trading your labor. But I'd like you to unpack that a little bit, right? What do you see as the objective basis for alienation right now? I wonder to what degree does the international division of labor and imperialism and so forth factor into that, right? Which is basically a way of saying, to what degree is it adequate to just break workers out of this alienation and become an ideological struggle, read Marx, which is great, But I'm sure you have a lot more to say on, what you would see about the particular forms of the objective basis of kind of alienation that keeps us, so most of our would-be comrades and allies instead, kind of stuck into what you call the most influential myths in the history of humanity. So if you can unpack that a little bit, that'd be good.
Well, we don't have too much time.
Yeah.
Let me just I'm trying to emphasize what I come to think of as the most important piece
of the workers' alienation. There is various pieces to it. And alienation itself all has to do with breaking something up which belongs together and breaking it up in a way so that people don't see the kind of connections which they did or could have if it wasn't broken up in the way that it is, and it happens in the kind of life and work that goes on in capitalist society, particularly in capitalist society. But what I would try to emphasize in my talk is what I came to see that is really decisive here is that there's some confusion about who needs who. Sounds simple. Who needs who? We don't all need each other. We don't all need each other in the same way or to the same degree. And the workers certainly don't need each other to make something which only they are involved in making. And the capitalists have had a way of presenting it, supported by the culture, which, as I indicated, they also control through the media that they own and the government that they control, and so on. They create so that it's common sense that the capitalist plays a crucial role in hiring workers for the job. And I'm saying that the workers have to come to see that that's not the case. That we could make everything we make without the whole class of capitalists. And that this is something that one can begin to make a difference on by, especially in a rich time, by the capitalists, by the workers recognizing it and spreading the word that look at all that we could do with the money which goes to the capitalists, especially if the capitalists are getting richer and richer and richer. Look at all we could do with the way of life we can have. And all this with shorter hours and safer rules of work. So I'm thinking that this is a way of, insofar as we have any connection with real workers, and insofar as there are groups of workers who are looking for a way to improve their situation, I think this is really a turning point. And this should be made a major element of smashing this enormous and so effective piece of mythology.
My camera right now.
I have a question for you. This is for David. But I believe that lowering consumption and in turn production will serve as the main objective in terms of addressing climate change. I think that along with carbon sequestering, regenerative agriculture, as you discussed, putting carbon back in the ground will help, but I think that it's economic activity in general that's the driving force behind climate change, be it U.S. oil consumption or Chinese concrete production, etc. Overpopulation aside, the regeneration of the workforce being its own facet to this problem. How do we achieve a long-term slowdown of economic activity via socialism without falling into the same development, progress, growth models that we saw, for example, in the Stalin era in the Soviet Union or today in modern China? Why wouldn't socialist labor organization or worker co-ops, for that matter, continue to maximize profit and continue us on the same path of exploitation and degeneration of natural resources? The only answer I've come up with via Marxist analysis is that by labor keeping their own surplus value, they could theoretically decide to work less, like you both mentioned, and along with paying farmers not to farm, I guess, as another example, and therefore lowering production and consumption, not commuting to work as much, not using great resources at work. But what's to say that a group of workers/owners wouldn't decide to work more to make more collective profit for themselves? Thus destroying the capitalist class, but at the same time continuing the destruction of the planet.
Okay. I think you're wonderful to hear all the perspectives and that all this theory in the practice. And I'm an activist. I want to ask people to do things, and how do I? We're working for a new party, a new major party in the United States. We want to get on the right foot. And I think that, Michael, what you're saying about cutting out the beneficiaries, in actuality, what does that look like? How do you envision it? How do we get ourselves oriented to do that? And how will it, what can we say to motivate people that that is the right action to take? I think all of these ideas are, if they're going to work, let's do them. Like, how do we get them in action?
Yes? Anybody else? Yes?
To the first speaker, you were talking about how these companies blatantly just say their plans on how they're going to create droughts and, flooding. How these people are not charged with conspiracy against, and how are they dodging this? So this is like blatantly how they do it in your face. They should be charged, just put in jail. And if you can give us an example of how they dodge this, because they have all the power books, how to understand how they dodge the guys.
Following up on the question to Bertell, Ollman, a lot of work today is by nature capital intensive. For instance, if you're a software engineer, you depend on some kind of gigantic, or if you're in finance, let's say a software engineer, you depend on some kind of gigantic infrastructure that costs a huge amount of money just to be able to get anything done. And so it's not so easy just to walk out and put a shingle out and start working, or create a co-op. There are tech co-ops, but there aren't that many and they're small. And I think this is the big impediment. And I'm just using this as an example, but there are many examples of labor that at this stage of capitalism is very, very capital intensive and requires some huge, gigantic investment of money in order to get started at all. So I wonder how you would address that.
Well, I just want to say that there are many demonstrations that I've been in, and conclusion to this, please listen up. I've been in the embassy protection demonstrations, and I've been an embassy protector outside in cases, and Pacific Partnership demonstrations, the water protection demonstrations with propane, and single-payer health care, and every one of the demonstrations I'm talking about, plus several more. Margaret Flowers, MD, a popular musician, has been in those demonstrations.
I really appreciate the global economic analysis that you gave us. It's like the real cost of the hamburger, right? The real cost of pollution. My problem, though, is that the notion of sweeping capitalism away is where do we get the power to do this? I did a panel on election integrity. We're trying to make elections actually democratic. Another person who came in from Maui said we should work at the county level. The Republicans discovered the state level to take over, and he's discovered that at the county level you can actually change Walmart's treatment of its workers. And so these may be granular solutions to power. Because capitalists are hugely powerful. They have the media, they have the government, they have everything. We can't just sweep over it. But what about the arguments about green jobs? The other economy, the Green New Deal. Do you reject those?
No, of course not.
Okay, but are they capitalists? Are they capitalists?
But what I'm saying is they're marginal, and they won't compete with the big power structures that are pushing and responsible for the crisis. Big oil, big agriculture, national military industry.
Okay, there's one more.
I'm so I'm active with the Buddhist Action Coalition here in New York. And I just wanted to specifically thank Professor Harvey for talking about the larger context of environmental degradation, sure, greenhouse gas emissions, but also bringing in, ocean acidification, soil depletion, all of which the number one contribution in total is animal agriculture. And I come to these to leftist groups, and animal agriculture is the elephant in the room, and human beings do not need to consume animal products. It is, talk about exploitation of surplus value onto one's life of a being who provides secretions and their flesh. And I get a room full of blank stares every time I stand up and do this, but I do it continuously because it is immoral, absent survival situation. situation to consume animals because they are sentient beings, and it is the number one, in total, the number one contribution to this subject, particularly of climate chaos onto collapse of civilization. I'm no fan of being catastrophic either, but the reality. But we're looking at some pretty serious implications, and I just invite you all to consider that. You know, and to the cost of a hamburger being made, the cost of life, sentient beings.
Anyone who hasn't spoken? Okay,
just a couple of things to follow up. I started in a sense with Bertell's concept of totality. Totality is something that you carve out and look at the internal relations within that totality. Marx did this in a certain way to talk about the totality of capital, which is very different from the totality of capitalism. But what I tried to do in the last book was to lay out a scenario in which you could start to think about the circulation of capital through production, realization, distribution, and some of the relations, but to embed it in a broader sense of totality. And one of those broader moments is, of course, the metabolic relation to nature, which I think is critical to look at and to expand the concept of totality as Marx said, to incorporate how nature is transformed, how natural processes intervene and interrelate to dynamics of accumulation. But then there are other elements which come in too, which comes back to a comment that you were making. There's no way in which you can transform capital or understand capital without understanding the whole sphere of social reproduction, the whole reproduction of daily life and how daily life is lived. There's no way in which you can understand the process of realization in the market without understanding wants, needs and desires, or how those wants, needs and desires are constituted, how capital actually is transformative in relationship to wants, needs and desires. It's a long history of that. And part of what this environmental question poses, and I think this is an opportunity as well as a complication, is that we have to think about the transformations of daily life. We have to think about the cultural transformations which are required, and you mentioned the whole kind of questions of alienation. I think the alienation in our relation to nature is something very important to address. And it is, in some respects, as important as the economic question. And now, at this point, people will say, well, you're going back to your petty bourgeois, romantic poet origins. And my answer to that is, well, a bit of romanticism in this is not a bad idea. And I think the whole kind of reconstruction of our relation to nature, the way in which it is instrumentally used, and Monsanto, and we can go on and on and on about how capital does it. But that's one of the big critiques of capital, is it has no aesthetic notion of what the relation to nature might be about, and therefore the aesthetic question is absolutely a critical way in which to get into this particular issue, and we should not neglect it. And I think one of the things that Marxists have had a hard time doing is actually accepting that, even though if you go back to the economic and philosophic manuscripts, there's some very, very interesting ways in which Marx begins to talk about this. Of course, Marx moved on later on to an objective analysis of alienation, which I think is very important and very fine. But for myself, I think it was wrong to take the view that you abandon the aesthetic perspective which exists in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. So to me, there is that dimension which needs to be taken care of, and so I think it's this is an opportunity for a much broader sense of critique. And I think it will involve cultural shifts. There's no way in which a socialist society can come about with the existing cultural norms which exist in our society. There has to be a cultural assault. And I think that actually one of the things that I found in the circles I moved in, and it was the cultural producers, if you like, and the cultural movements which existed, full of references to these kinds of issues. Not maybe in a very clear anti-capitalist way, but there's a good basis there. And one of the things that I think that we should be doing is to emphasize how to pull a lot of that together into an anti-capitalist politics, which focuses very much on what I think is something that everybody here, I think, would accept, that there's no way you're going to solve many of these interesting contradictions which exist without actually attacking the capitalist mode of production and starting to look towards the construction of an alternative way to produce and reproduce daily life.